Ever given a thought to the untold tales of our history? Take, for instance, the Yamasee War of 1715, a monumental conflict that rattled the very core of South Carolina and irreversibly affected the indigenous tribe. This war, shrouded in mystery, was of such gravity that its effects are still felt today. It was a battle of survival and power between the local Yamasee tribes, often referred to as the Black Indians, and the British invaders. The Yamasee risked it all, their lands and their liberty, as the colonists began abducting Yamasee women as compensation for debts unpaid through slave labor. The war was brutal, wiping out nearly 10% of the white populace in South Carolina. So, fasten your seatbelts as we plunge into this overlooked piece of history. The seeds of the Yamasee War were sown in the thriving trade of Indian slaves. This was not a mere subplot in the grand narrative of the Carolina colony's history, but rather a pivotal axis around which revolved the economic gears of this burgeoning settlement. Imagine this: a staggering 25% of all slaves in South Carolina were not Africans, but Native Americans, the indigenous inhabitants of these lands. The trade in these Indian slaves was not a haphazard business, but a finely tuned enterprise, driven by the merciless gears of market forces. South Carolina's economy, you see, was deeply entwined with slave labor. It wasn't just about working the plantations, but the trade of slaves to other plantation colonies as well. Most Indian slaves sold in the bustling markets of Charleston found themselves later traded to other colonies, their lives reduced to mere commodities in this ruthless trade. This trade in Indian slaves was not an isolated phenomenon, but a significant cog in the larger machine of economic and political competition between the colonizing powers of Europe. South Carolina, in particular, leaned heavily on the Indian slave trade to build and expand its colony. Among the tribes that bore the brunt of this exploitation were the Yamasee tribes, historically described as the Black Indians. These tribes held a significant place in the Carolina colony's slave market. Their women were taken as payment for unpaid labor, an act that served as a cruel testament to the colonists' insatiable greed and utter disregard for indigenous rights. This mounting tension and discontent among the Yamasee tribes was like a pressure cooker ready to explode. And explode it did. The enslavement of Yamasee women for unpaid labor was the spark that ignited the deadly confrontation known as the Yamasee War. The stage was set, the players ready, and all it needed was this spark to set off one of the deadliest wars in the history of British colonial America. On April 15, 1715, the simmering tensions exploded into a full-blown conflict. As the early morning mist lay heavy over the South Carolinian settlements, Yamasee warriors, driven by a desperate need to protect their people, launched a series of surprise attacks. The British colonists, unprepared for such a swift and brutal onslaught, were taken aback. The Yamasee, historically described as the Black Indians, were not just fighting for their land, but for their very existence. Their women, referred to by the Creeks as the daughters of the sun, due to their dark-skinned complexion, were being taken as payment for unpaid slave labor. The native tribe could not and would not stand idle as their people were being enslaved. In the early stages of the war, the Yamasee were inflicting mass casualties on the British colonists. The British, used to conventional warfare, were caught unprepared in the face of guerrilla tactics employed by the Yamasee. This was not a conflict fought on open fields, but one that took place in the dense forests and swamps, the terrain that the Yamasee knew like the back of their hand. Scholars William Ramsey and Donald Grinder shed light on the severity of the situation, stating that almost 10% of the white population in South Carolina were killed, and almost all of them were slave catchers. This grim statistic serves as a stark reminder of the high stakes of this conflict. However, wars are not won by initial victories alone. As the conflict wore on, the situation began to change. The British, with their superior resources, started to regroup. But the most significant twist came from within the native tribes themselves. The tide of the war began to change when some native tribes, such as the Cherokees, switched sides. With this shift in alliances, the balance of power tilted in favor of the British. The Yamasee, now facing opposition from both the colonists and erstwhile allies, found their position increasingly untenable. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Yamasee War, one that would further shape the course of this forgotten conflict. As the dust settled, the landscape of South Carolina and the lives of its inhabitants were forever changed. The Yamasee War, a brutal conflict that raged for 2 years, had come to an end. But the echoes of this war reverberated through the decades, shaping the destiny of the region and its people. The remaining Yamasee, once a formidable force, were now a broken tribe. Their numbers decimated, their land lost. They were forced to migrate south. They found refuge among the Yuchi and Seminoles in Georgia and Florida, their cultures blending together, creating a unique tapestry of traditions and resilience. The war had a profound impact on the indigenous population. Not only did it drastically reduce their numbers, it also reshuffled the power dynamics among the tribes. The Yamasee, once a dominant power, were now scattered and weakened. The Cherokees, who had switched sides during the war, emerged as a significant force in the region. The tribe's interactions with colonists were forever marked by this conflict, a bitter memory of betrayal and loss. For the colony of South Carolina, the war was a wake-up call. The devastation wrought by the war made the colonists realize the unsustainable nature of their reliance on Indian slavery. It became evident that the colony's aggressive expansion and exploitation of indigenous tribes were counterproductive. The war marked a turning point, leading to a gradual shift away from Indian slavery. Yet, the scars of the war were deep, and the memory of the great loss of life was a somber reminder of the human cost of colonial expansion. The Yamasee War was a transformative event, a crucible in which the future of the region was forged, a war that changed the social, political, and economic landscape of South Carolina forever. If this glimpse into a story lost to time has captured your imagination, smash that like button. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the unknown. Lastly, for more information about the names and subjects mentioned in this video, get your copy of the Amazon best-selling book series, 19 White Men Who Admitted There Were Indigenous Black People in the Americas, and 13 Black Scholars Who Admitted There Were Black People in the Americas Before Columbus by Chase McGee. Link in the description. Stay curious and keep exploring.